Well, this story is about my mother. And my mother, as I think I mentioned earlier, grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. And when she met my father, he was a student at John Carroll University, and she was a student at a small women's college in Cleveland called Notre Dame. And the two schools shared resources. And they met in a psychology class, where my mother was one of two women. And after they graduated, they were married, and they moved to Chicago, where my father went to medical school. And my mother, who had studied social work at Notre Dame, quickly found work as a social worker at Cook County Department of Social Services. And at that time, aid to families with dependent children was a very important resource for many of the poor people who had left the rural South and were migrating north into the cities, into Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and so forth. So my mother's clients lived near the stockyards and the packing plants in Chicago, and she would travel by public transportation into the poor neighborhoods, and she would climb these mountains of staircases and knock on the doors, and was not particularly welcome when they realized where she was from, because it was her job to determine that there was no man in the house, no source of income, and if that was the case, then the families were okayed for public assistance. But my mother is so lovely. She's so beautiful. She has dark hair, and she has the most beautiful, striking blue eyes. She's very slim, and she's very graceful, and she looks very fragile, but she's very strong. And soon the people in these poor tenements welcomed my mother, and they allowed her to come into their apartments, and they were so happy that she would stay and visit for a little while. Well, she arrived at her new job in the early fall of 1948. By early winter, it was clear that she was pregnant for my oldest sister, Rita. Soon, in that cold Chicago winter that was so icy and windy, those mountains of stairs in the tenements were rather difficult for her to negotiate. And the streets were so snowy and icy, it became harder and harder for her to get around. But she went to her job every day. And when she would knock on the doors to those poor apartments, the grandmothers and the young mothers with children of their own would invite my mother in. And they'd make her sit down and rest and have a cup of tea. Sometimes they'd even force her to sit on the sofa and even lay down and take a little nap before they would let her go off into that cold Chicago winter. Well, I have to tell you, my mother welcomed their fussing over her and their small gestures of love and appreciation, because my mother's mother died when my mother was only 17 years old. She didn't have a mother to fuss over her in her pregnancy. Her own sisters were back in Cleveland, busy with their young families, and they weren't much help to her. And to make matters worse, my father's mother had also died when he was 17. Both my grandmothers died in 1941. And I like to think that they met in heaven. And that's why my mother and father are married today. So that winter dragged on. There wasn't any ice skating or tobogganing for my mother that she enjoyed in Cleveland, not while she was pregnant. And finally, the spring came, as spring always does after winter. And the snow melted, and she could shed some of those heavy winter clothes, and getting around was a little bit easier, but Rita was growing inside her, and it was kind of difficult to climb that mountain of stairways in those tenements. Well, one day, about 6 weeks before my sister was going to be born, it was an unusually hot day. And when she arrived in one of the neighborhoods where she had a couple of new clients, she was struck by how quiet things were. It was early afternoon, and some of the children were arriving home from school. And she asked them, "What's going on? Where is everyone?" She had knocked on some doorways, but no one seemed to be home. "Oh," said the children, "don't you know? There's been a walkout at the stockyards. Everybody's over there for the strike." And I don't know if it was concern for her clients or curiosity, but my mother went to see what was going on. And when she arrived, the police had just gotten there also, and things were getting pretty crazy. And in the confusion, my mother was forced into a paddy wagon, and with the other strikers, she was brought to the Cook County Jail, where the men and women were separated and put into separate holding cells. Well, one by one, the women went out to make their phone call. My father, who was a medical student at the time, was doing an externship at the Cook County Hospital, and she wasn't sure when it was her turn if she would be able to get a hold of him or not. And what was she to say to the operator who answered the phone at the hospital? So when her turn came, she said finally, tell him that his wife called. Tell him she's in jail. Tell him to come as quickly as possible. And that was her message. And she went back to the cell to wait for my father. One by one, the women left, and soon my mother was all alone. In a holding cell, you just have some uncomfortable benches. By this time, she was very hungry. She was dirty. She was thirsty. And she was very uncomfortable. She was due to give birth in only 6 weeks. Well, she sat there. The guards ignored her. My father didn't come. And as it got on toward evening, the cell door opened, and she looked up hopefully. But it was a couple of women, prostitutes, who had been picked up early that evening. They looked at my mother in surprise. And then they shouted for the guards. The language they used as they berated them for treating my mother this way was language my mother has never used herself, and she did not repeat for me when she told this story. Well, as the evening progressed, more and more women came in. The guards, having been verbally abused by the women, were able to produce some hot water and a towel, and one of the women had a clean comb, and they helped my mother wash her face and comb her hair. And they made her as comfortable as they could during the night. Each of them took turns letting her rest in their lap so she could get a few minutes of sleep. And well into the night, my mother says that she was deeply asleep, but I don't think so, because she felt tender hands stroking her hair, and she heard her voice that was so familiar to her. And she said, "Oh, Claire, don't worry. Don't be afraid. You and Rita will be just fine. Ed will be here soon to get you." And then she slept soundly until morning. And when she woke up, the other women were gone. And once again, she was alone in the cell. And then she heard some commotion out in the hall. And she heard the keys, and the door opened. And there was my father. And she was in his arms. And he murmured words that were indistinct, words of comfort and apology and love. And she said to him, "It's okay. My mother was with me. She told me not to worry." And my father said, "My mother came to me. I thought it was a dream. I fell asleep in the student lounge while I was doing my rounds. And my mother spoke to me. She said that you and Rita were fine." And they were. And they went home. And 6 weeks later, Rita was born. And you know, I used to think that my mother and father met because of my grandmothers. And now I know that they watch over us every day, our two guardian angels in heaven.